The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 11. It had been a few hours since their little road trip had started, and this was just the beginning. The landscape outside the truck had changed from the woodlands to rocky plains as they went further away from the city, and now they had finally entered into the sandy desert. The temperature had turned into a scorching heat with the hot desert sun above them. All around them, outside, all Maximus could see was sand. The dunes covered everything in the line of sight, and he felt like he was stuck in the middle of a sea of dust. Only their solitary transport truck moved along the sands, and the ride was definitely not comfy. Maximus was riding shotgun, and beside him Achilles was at the wheel. He said that it would probably take a couple of days before they reached the city. The others were at the back of the truck where Daedalus was being held. There was a window behind Max's seat which could be opened. It was large enough for a person to fit through, though probably not Rex. Through it, he saw that both Hedger and Rex were fast asleep. Rex had even begun to snore. Only Daedalus was still awake back there, still talking to himself. Maximus was pretty bored too, and Achilles wasn't in a very talkative mood. So instead, he just sat there staring out at the sands, and soon he was lost in his own thoughts. Well, he thought his life was definitely taking some drastic turns. They were heading to Athens, the capital of a country with which Mars was at war, and being an ex-soldier of Mars, he was still doubtful of going to Athens. Maximus had heard that Empress Athena was a fair woman who was renowned for her wisdom, but this did not reassure him enough to ride straight into an enemy capital. Both Mars and Minerva were on the same great continent, along with the kingdoms of 3 other Olympian gods, including Vulcan. There were a few other smaller kingdoms as well, but most of the continent was covered by the 5 kingdoms ruled by the gods. Ares dreamed of having the entire continent under his control. Since Jupiter, the empire ruled by Lord Zeus, was on a different continent, this dream of his did not risk angering the Olympian king. But what did stand in the war god's way was Athena. Her empire was the only one on the continent that stood on equal grounds with Mars in terms of size and military strength. Even though Ares had more soldiers, a larger army, and a stronger magical unit, Athena's military was able to keep up with them because of their unimaginable and advanced technology and weaponry. They also had a very strong air force, which acted as an advantage over Ares's forces, which were primarily land-based. Maximus wondered whether any of the other kingdoms on the continent would be able to stand up to Ares if Minerva was defeated. It didn't seem a likely possibility, and most would probably ally with Ares to avoid war. But all this was if Mars won. The war had been going on for nearly 5 years now without either side faltering. Maximus was still in deep thought about world politics, or whatever he knew about it, when Achilles woke him from his daydreams. "Are you listening to me, Max?" Achilles said. "Sorry, sort of drifted off for a second there. What did you say?" Maximus asked. "I said that we are stopping for a while. I can see an oasis up ahead, and it might be the only one for miles. We can collect some water there, and according to my calculations, it's about time Daedalus woke up as well." Maximus looked out the window and saw the oasis which Achilles was talking about. It was just a small group of trees with some water in the middle. It looked like an island in the middle of the sea made of sand. "Good idea. Besides, the tank's almost empty. We'll refuel it there as well. And I can drive for a while if you like." Achilles nodded in agreement. Even though there were 5 of them, only Maximus and Achilles could actually drive. Rex couldn't drive because it really was a 2-handed job, and Hedger's feet wouldn't reach the pedals. Even if they let Daedalus drive, it would only be for short bursts of 15 minutes. So the job was stuck with the 2 of them. Once they had stopped at the oasis, Maximus went to the back to wake the others. Hedger got up and asked, "Are we there yet?" Rex got up too, and he was rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. "Man, I haven't slept so much in a long time. It's so boring. We should have brought a pack of cards or something," he said. "Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't aware we were planning to get kicked out of our homes and take a long road trip to an enemy country. But Rex, if you already knew all this, then a set of cards would have been great. Or maybe a travel chessboard," Hedger said with a grin, and Rex just scowled at him and grumbled something under his breath. Maximus laughed at this, and then he realized things could have been much worse. At least he had his 2 best friends with him on this insane road trip. "Come on, guys. There's fresh water here, and it might be our last chance to fill up on some for a while," Maximus said. And they got out of the truck along with Daedalus and went to the side of the water hole where Achilles was already sitting with his bionic foot stretched on the sands. Hedger cannonballed straight into the water with a splash. He hadn't even bothered to take his clothes off, but Maximus knew that in this heat they would dry off quickly. Rex went up to the water and started washing his face and taking a drink. They had just begun to cool off when Achilles looked at them and said, "It seems we have a bit of company." He pointed at the dry bushes at the side. At first, Maximus saw nothing, and then he realized that there was some movement within the bushes. "What is that?" Rex asked. And as if to answer his question, a tiny man jumped out of it. It wasn't actually a man at all. It was a goblin. And soon, the one that jumped out was joined by 7 or 8 of his friends. They were yet another race present in this world. They were just about the size of a child, roughly hedger size. They stood on 2 legs and had 2 hands like humans, but that was where the similarities ended. Their skin was a brown color, and it was leathery like that of a reptile. They had almost no hair whatsoever on their heads. Just a few strands popped up here and there. Also, they had really pointy features. They had pointy ears, a long and pointy nose, and even pointy teeth. Maximus had seen goblins before in the trenches, but not ones like these. For one thing, the ones in the trenches were fully clothed. These, on the other hand, barely covered their private parts with some leaves and twigs. They were also carrying weapons in their hands that were made from wood and animal bones. "Those are some real ugly babies," Hedger said, getting out of the water. "They are called sand goblins. And like most goblins prefer hot climates, so they're really common in the desert," Achilles said. The goblins were eyeing them with their weapons raised now. "Yeah, so what do they want with us?" Maximus asked. "Well, it seems that this oasis is part of their territory, and they seem to think that we are trying to take it from them. So, they will probably attack us now." "Can't we explain to them that we're just taking a break?" Maximus said. Achilles shook his head. "No, I'm afraid not. These goblins don't seem to have ever been touched by modern civilization. I don't think they can even understand what we are saying." Rex stepped forward and said, "So we gotta fight these little munchkins." "That's fine by me." He took out his hammer ready to fight. "It won't be much trouble, really. I have fought them before. They're not very strong," Achilles said. Just as Rex was about to charge at them, Maximus stepped in and said, "Guys, would it be okay if I take this one? It's just that I'm not that familiar with my new sword yet, and I think that it would be good practice." This was true, of course, but he was also hoping to bring back the red glow from before. When he had practiced in the cave, the glow hadn't come no matter what he tried. Rex wasn't too happy with this since he was really bored, but he grunted okay. Maximus moved forward and drew his sword while the others sat back and watched. Just as Maximus took a few steps forward, the goblins attacked. They were quite fast, but their attacks weren't exactly powerful. As long as Maximus kept away from the sharp edges, he was fine. He was easily able to avoid his attackers, and soon he started striking back. The sword felt fluid in his arms, and its balance was perfect. But the red glow did not come, and he could feel the difference in power. It just didn't have the same strength as before. The goblins kept attacking, but it was very random with no real planning, and because of this they kept getting in each other's way. Maximus didn't really have to try very hard. The goblin attacks were very predictable. One of the goblins tried to attack Max's arm, but he dodged it and took him down with a single strike. Then he slashed another before it could even raise its wood and bone club. Soon enough, almost all of them were on the ground. Maximus faced them, expecting them to get up and fight again, and it seemed for a moment they were about to. But then, suddenly, all of them decided to run away instead. Wow, Maximus thought to himself. He had never scared anyone so much that they ran away from the fight. He was pretty pleased with himself when he suddenly felt that one was still left, and that he was standing right behind him. He swung his sword to the back, but to his surprise it got blocked. It was not blocked by a goblin, but by a man. He had not just blocked it either, he had actually caught the sharp edge of the blade with his hand without even a paper cut. Maximus understood now why the goblins had run. He guessed that it would be most people's first instinct when they were faced with a god. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 12. He had no idea how this person had got behind him, or even come into the oasis so fast without anyone noticing, but Maximus knew who the man standing before him was. He was a pretty famous person, and he had seen him on the big screen in the town square of the trenches many times. The screen was usually used to show important messages, and this was the man who normally gave them if the issue was of an international standard. He had wavy brown hair that looked messy and perfect at the same time. He was clean-shaven and very good-looking. Not the rugged kind of look Achilles had, but more of a playful and mischievous look. He looked like someone who could charm anyone with a smile, and he had a smirk fixed on his face. His eyes were the color of bronze, and he was wearing a golden tracksuit with a matching pair of pants. He looked like someone who was going out for a morning jog. He even had sneakers on his feet with wing designs on them, and a pair of earphones clipped onto his tracksuit. Oh, and he was also a god, the god of communications and messengers, in fact, Hermes. "Slow down, kid, before you poke someone's eye out with that," Hermes said with a smirk. He then let go of the sword, and Maximus staggered back a bit. There was no mistaking it was him. He even had the symbol of his kingdom on the left side of his chest. A rod with 2 snakes coiling around it with a pair of wings on the sides. Hermes turned to face Achilles now, who had already drawn his sword. "What do you want?" Hermes, Achilles asked. It was obvious from his tone that he was not happy to see him. "Why, I was just taking a stroll around this neighborhood, when I heard my good old friends Achilles and Daedalus were in town. So I just had to check up on you," Hermes said, in a mocking tone. "Besides, you should know by now, Achilles, that if I want something, I usually just take it." For a moment, Maximus thought he had disappeared, but then he realized he was standing right behind him. And that was not all. He was holding Max's blade in his hand. Hermes had stolen it from his hands, and he barely had time to notice. "You are called the god of thieves for a reason after all," Achilles said. Hermes had an annoyed look on his face at this comment. "I prefer to be called the god of speed, actually. After all, it is my speed which allows me to steal whatever I want," Hermes said. And then he started examining the blade. He turned to Maximus and said, "You know, kid, this sword seems to be a bit out of your league. I could take it off your hands and give you a very handsome price for it." Maximus didn't care if this guy was a god. That sword was the best weapon he had ever held, and he wasn't going to sell it because a sleazy sales god just came asking for it. "No thanks, I think I'll stick with it for a while," he said. "Ah, too bad. I could have given you good money for it," Hermes said, and tossed the sword back to Maximus. "Your hustling skills are getting a bit rusty, it seems," Achilles said. "Oh, but I'm not here to buy swords now, am I? I'm much more interested in all the trouble you two have been getting into." "So are you here to take Daedalus back to Ares?" Rex asked. "Oh no, my dear Minotaur. My business is not bounty hunting, it's information. I merely want to know what's happening that's of interest around the world," Hermes said with a smile. "And selling the information to the highest bidder," Achilles said. Hermes had a grin on his face now. "Well, I did say it was a business." Maximus didn't understand why a person like Hermes would want more money. He was the king of the land of Mercury, and it was one of the richer countries of the world. Also, he was the CEO of the company called Swiftfoot Industries. The company held the monopoly on a lot of things, almost all of which were communication related, including the post office, magic mirror messaging or M3S, and most importantly, the phone lines. Maximus wondered what kind of profit he could reap from being an information broker. "Well, we are not telling you anything," Achilles said. "Put down your sword, Achilles. I have no reason to fight. Besides, my biggest question was who had rescued dear old Daedalus, and I already got my answer to that," Hermes said. He then walked up to Daedalus and said, "I just have to check one more thing. A rumor really that our good friend Daedalus here had gone crazy." He was right next to Daedalus's face now. "And judging by the fact that he has been so silent till now, I guess the rumors are true. Or perhaps I merely do not enjoy conversing with an arrogant and pompous god such as yourself," Daedalus said with a smile. "Why, Daedalus, you're still your old and charming self." "It just goes to show that you can't believe everything you hear," Hermes said. Then he began walking away from them and said, "Well, that will be all, boys. My ride's already here." He pointed up and they saw a helicopter way up in the sky. "How do you plan to get up there, though?" Hedger asked. As if to answer his question, the pair of wings sprang out from both his sneakers. "You can fly?" Maximus asked, somewhat impressed. "No, I just use these to steer when I'm in the sky," Hermes told him, looking at the wings. "In reality, I'm just so fast that I can run on air." "Well, got to run. I heard one of Athena's science geeks has invented a phone that requires no wires or anything. He's calling it a cell phone or something, and I just have to get in on that," Hermes said, and then he shot up into the helicopter. Within a few seconds he was in the helicopter. It began to fly out of sight after that. "It seems our luck has not run out. I came back to my senses just in time," Daedalus said. "You never cease to surprise, Daedalus," Achilles said. Maximus, on the other hand, was in quite a shock. It was the first time he had actually met a god. He realized why the gods ruled the world now. The sheer power that he felt from Hermes was amazing. Though he tried to hide it from the messenger god, he knew that Hermes could have killed him so easily that he wouldn't even have had time to blink. So that was Hermes, huh? Any reason why he went out of his way to see us, or was he telling the truth about taking a stroll in the desert? Hedger asked. Achilles looked up into the sky to make sure that the helicopter was nowhere in sight. Only then did he put away his sword. "I have no idea, but he isn't the type to do something without a reason. I'm sure he has his own agenda." "But why would someone as rich and powerful as Hermes need to act as an information broker?" That Maximus asked. "Communication is his business, and because of this, a lot of information flows his way," Achilles said. "And it's not just money he's after. Having the right information gets him connected to the right people, gets him into places. And sometimes valuable information can be traded for favors, even among other gods." Whenever Maximus had seen Hermes on screen, he had never thought of him as someone so dangerous. He always just thought of him as a wealthy guy who enjoyed the high life. But now that he had met him in person, he seemed more cunning and menacing than most monsters. It seems he wasted a lot of my precious time, though. I merely have 2 minutes left with my brain, Daedalus said. I think we should start moving again. The faster we reach the Vulcan capital, the better, Achilles said. Then he turned to the old inventor and asked, Any words of wisdom before you leave us again? Daedalus thought for a moment and said, Yes, actually. The sun is beginning to set, and the desert is a much more dangerous place at night since most of its predatory species are nocturnal. It would be wise to camp for the night instead of continuing with the drive if we wish to avoid them. Just what kind of species are we talking about here? Hedger asked simply. Well, I believe there is a certain breed of desert serpents that may grow to over 50 foot long, which is native to this desert, Daedalus answered. Well, that should help me sleep peacefully, Hedger said, clearly regretting he had asked anything. Well then, we will drive for a couple of hours and then set up camp once it gets really dark, agreed? Achilles asked. But it was too late. Daedalus had just returned to his mumbling mode. I think if he could, he would say that he would love to camp instead of taking his chances with a giant desert snake, Hedger said with a smile. The Soldiers of Ares, Chapter 13. They packed up, refueled the truck, and started moving again, only this time with Maximus at the wheel. It had been a while since he had driven anything, and it took some time to get used to again, but he was still managing to slug along even though the bumpy, sand-filled path wasn't helping. Achilles was in the back now, taking a nap, and instead Hedger was in the side seat, and Rex was peeking in through the window behind them. You're veering to the left again, Rex said. His backseat driving had started since Maximus took the wheel, and it was starting to get on his nerves. But Maximus knew that Rex had been a pretty good driver back when he had both his arms. But now driving was just one more thing he couldn't do. So Maximus just let it go. The sun had completely set now, and the change in temperature was drastic. It had been hot enough to cook eggs just a while ago, but now it was so cold that it made Max's teeth quiver. The path was much harder to see now, especially since one of the truck's headlights had been damaged when the manticore thrashed it. Actually, the entire left side was pretty banged up, and Maximus thought it was a miracle it made it this far. We should be stopping soon, right? I mean, it's getting pretty dark now. Besides, I'm starving, Hedger said after about 2 hours or so. He was right. Even with the headlight and high beam, they really couldn't see much further. Rex pointed outside and said, Look, let's stop at that huge pile of rocks over there and set up camp. The rocks should shield us from the winds. Maximus agreed with him, and soon they were parked near the huge rock formation. They got off and tried to set up camp, which was hard since they had absolutely nothing to make, even a tent. I guess we all crash in the truck then, Rex said. Yeah. 3 of us in the back, 1 guy up front, and the last guy has to stand watch anyway so he doesn't need to sleep, Hedger concluded. Maximus realized they still needed to eat something. What we could do, though, is build a fire to cook the rabbits we caught yesterday. Start looking around for dried twigs and stuff, he said. Those will be easy to find since we are in a desert, Hedger said sarcastically. Stop complaining and start looking, Rex said, and Max, go and wake Achilles up, he'll want to know we stopped. Why do I have to do it? Maximus protested. Well, you're a human, he's a human, birds of a feather, Rex said with a stupid grin. Maximus scowled at him and went into the truck's back to wake him. It was not something he was comfortable with, probably because the man slept with one hand around his sword, like he was ready to cut anything even in his sleep. Maximus just hoped that anything did not involve people trying to wake him up. Achilles, he said, and barely touched his shoulder as the swordsman got up immediately. Luckily, he did not draw his sword. What's wrong? He asked. Nothing, just wanted to let you know that we stopped for the night. After that, they helped Daedalus out of the truck and went to where the other 2 were trying to make a fire. When they reached the side of the rock where the wind was the least, they saw that Hedger was sitting on the ground in front of a very small pile of scrubs and twigs, banging 2 rocks together trying to produce a spark. Personally, Maximus thought he looked retarded. Rex was still walking around searching for scrubs. I'm starting to think that this grinding rock to make fire theory is a lie. You guys were all soldiers, right? Didn't you get Boy Scout training on stuff like this, actually? Rex came back with some more scrubs and made the pile a bit bigger. We did, actually, Rex said, and you need a special type of rock called flintstones to make it work. Well now, any of you wouldn't just happen to have some flintstones laying around in your pockets, would you? Hedger asked the group. No, but I have something better, Achilles said. Then he pulled something out of his pocket. It was not a stone of any kind, but a lighter. He went ahead to light the pile with it, and soon they had a fire burning, which just made Hedger look like an idiot with his rocks. Well, that was easy, wasn't it, Hedge? Rex said while patting his back. Hedger just grumbled and threw his rocks away. They went ahead to start cooking the rabbits they had caught before, or at least Maximus did. but he was used to this. He was sort of the unofficial cook of the group. He didn't mind though. He liked cooking, and more importantly, whenever the other two tried to help, whatever they were cooking usually turned to charcoal. The problem was he didn't have much to work with, but he still managed to add some flavor to the rabbits with the cherries Hedger had picked up. He even fried some mushrooms for the side. Soon they were all around their tiny campfire eating their dinner. "I thought you were against eating cute little rabbits," Rex asked Hedger. "You know, once they're all cooked and fried, they're not so cute anymore," he said, taking a large bite from his rabbit leg. Achilles was enjoying the rabbit too. "You know, Maximus, this is really good. I haven't had such a good meal for a while, actually." "That's our Max for you. Great with a blade on the battlefield, even better with it in the kitchen," Hedger said. Even Achilles smiled at this. The only one not joining in the conversation was Daedalus, for obvious reasons. But still, Maximus thought that the potion he made was something amazing. Because even though his mind was clearly not there, his body continued to do all the basic functions. Like if you placed some food in his hands, he would eat it on his own. It was like his body was on autopilot. After that, everyone began to turn in for the night, and Maximus decided to take first watch, even though the others had all taken naps before Maximus insisted on standing guard. The truth was that he dreaded going back to sleep. Something about an enigmatic voice speaking to him through his dreams was kind of appalling. He knew he would have to sleep sooner or later, but he just chose to do it later. Hours had passed, and Maximus was feeling pretty drowsy by now, and he really wanted to go to bed. But he still refused to go to sleep since he had taken the responsibility of keeping watch. The rock shielded him from most of the wind, but it was still really cold. He had climbed on top of the truck now, since sand kept entering his pants when he sat on the ground. He sat there for a while, staring at the sands. Achilles had told them that Vulcan City was just a day's drive away now, and that they should be there by this time tomorrow. After a while, he heard the truck door open, and someone came out. It was Achilles. Maximus came down to greet him. "Out for a quick smoke?" Maximus asked casually. Achilles shook his head. He said, "Actually, I came to relieve you from the watch. I don't sleep well at night anyway. And I don't smoke." "Oh, I just assumed since you had that lighter with you and all," Maximus said. Achilles took out the lighter from his pocket. "This is not mine. It belonged to a friend of mine who died in the war. I just hold on to it as a keepsake." "I'm sorry to hear that," Maximus said, and he regretted opening his mouth now. "Don't be," Achilles said. "Soldiers are born to die in battle, and if you survive, it doesn't make you great. It just means you were chosen to honor the memory of your fallen comrades." Maximus nodded silently to this. After a few seconds of awkward silence, Maximus asked, "So are you a part of Athena's army then?" Achilles shook his head in response and said, "No, I haven't been part of any army since the fall of Troy, and I don't plan to join any either. I mostly just move around a lot now as a wanderer, but I do still work as a mercenary though, when I need money. Sadly, the 10-year Trojan War made fighting my only form of revenue." Maximus could relate to this. When he was in the army, fighting and killing were all he knew, but luckily when he got out, these skills were pretty useful for a scavenger. "So someone hired you as a mercenary to save Daedalus?" he asked. "No, this wasn't a job," Achilles said. "Daedalus and I go way back, and I owe him a great deal. When a friend of mine from Athens informed me that he had been kidnapped, I began tracking him down immediately." Maximus nodded to the story, but he still didn't get up to go to sleep. "You don't seem too eager to go to bed?" Achilles asked. Maximus shifted uncomfortably and said, "It's just that I'm not used to getting visions and all." "Yes, those can be real annoying," Achilles said. Maximus looked at him with surprise. "Have you ever got any?" Achilles nodded in agreement. "Even if you're not a prophet or oracle, visions can be given to you. Of course, there is some powerful sorcery involved. Back before technology had gotten so far, they were one of the safest ways to give information, even if it is very annoying to the receiver. But these visions are only related to the past or present. You still need a prophet to tell you prophecies of the future." Maximus processed this new information. This meant that whoever the voice belonged to was trying to help him survive long enough for him to absorb energy into the blade. He wondered what it was for, though. As for whom the voice belonged to, he still had no clue. There were thousands of powerful sorcerers, and even though a prophet was much rarer, there were still enough of them around too. And almost all the gods had incredible amounts of magical energy as well. "Yeah, well, I have to sleep sometime, I guess," Maximus said with a weak smile. He was about to go inside to sleep when an idea hit him. "Achilles, can I ask you something?" he said. Achilles turned to show he was listening. "Well, it's just that my new blade is an energy weapon, but I can't seem to make it work since the Manicore fight. I was hoping maybe you had some advice in the matter." Maximus thought it was a good idea. Who better to ask about a sword than one of the best swordsmen in the world? Your sword skills and footwork are actually pretty good, though you could still improve a lot, Achilles said. But when energy weapons are involved, your will also comes into play. Unless you are able to channel your will into your blade, it just won't work for you. Maximus nodded. He kind of understood what he was talking about, but he didn't know what to do about it. Achilles looked at him for a while and said, "Tell you what, once we reach Vulcan City and there's enough time, maybe I could give you some pointers." That would be great, Maximus said, surprised. It was like a dream come true. After all, training lessons from Achilles was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He thanked Achilles and bid him good night and finally went to bed. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 14. When Maximus woke up the next day, the truck was already moving. He woke up to see Rex sitting beside him, and Daedalus curled up in a corner. "Hey, you're finally up," Rex said. Maximus got to his feet to see Achilles at the wheel again. Hedger was beside him, combing through his wings. "How come no one woke me?" Maximus asked. Rex was busy chewing on a twig. Maximus realized he was using it like a toothpick. He took it out of his mouth and said, "Didn't see the point. No breakfast today since we're low on supplies, and Achilles said he would drive, so we thought we'd just let you sleep in. It's not like we got anything better to do." Maximus was rubbing the sleep out of his eyes now. "What do you mean low on supplies?" he asked. "Well, after the delicious dinner yesterday, all we got left are some fish. And we really got to eat those soon. I think they're starting to go bad," Rex said. Maximus paced around the truck for a while. He didn't get any visions or dreams last night. He guessed that the voice was not in a very talkative mood. But Maximus was sure he would hear from it soon enough. He got tired of pacing around and soon sat down looking out the window. Rex was right about one thing: there was nothing to do. All around them was just sand. The only forms of life out here were a few cacti and the occasional gecko. They did see another group of sand goblins, but these ones left them alone. There were no signs of any giant desert serpents either, which Maximus wasn't complaining about. After a while, Maximus said, "Kinda dull compared to yesterday, huh?" "You mean with no gods popping out to say hi?" "Yeah, it kind of is," Rex said. "Don't relax just yet. We still got a day to go before we reach the city." "But I guess we have to stop to eat," Achilles said. "I'll say, the fish are starting to smell," Hedger chipped in. Soon they stopped at another oasis. This one was not nearly as big as the last one, more like a really large puddle. They started up a fire again, and soon enough they were chewing fish bones. "So, we gonna head into the city tonight or in the morning?" Hedger asked them. Maximus just stared at him, confused. "Oh, I almost forgot you didn't get the daily Daedalus update while you were asleep," Hedger told him. He explained to Maximus that when Daedalus was back to his senses this morning, he mentioned that he'd been to this area before. He said that the way they were going was a trail which people rarely took and had no real entrance to the city. So when they reached the city, they would need the help of their border patrol to get in. Daedalus also mentioned that it might be smarter to approach them in the morning, since if they went at night, they might get mistaken for bandits and get shot at. "So what's the plan?" Maximus asked, now that he was up to date with the whole story. "Well, that depends on whether or not we can make contact with my friend in Vulcan City before we reach it. If we do, we can go in tonight. He will escort us in without any problems," Achilles said. "And how exactly are we supposed to contact him from the middle of the desert?" Hedger asked, throwing away the fishbone he was chewing on. Achilles opened his bag and started searching. Then he took something out and said, "With this." Achilles showed them a black, rather bulky-looking box with an antenna. It was a walkie-talkie. "I've been trying to contact him every 2 hours or so since morning," Achilles said. Maximus had used them before while in the army, but he didn't think that the range was so good that it could cover half a desert. "So your friend already knows we're coming then?" Rex asked. "Actually, I haven't seen him in quite a while, but if I know him, he'll have one of these with him all the time," Achilles said, putting away the walkie-talkie. Maximus wasn't so sure about this, but he had learned to trust Achilles enough by now not to ask questions. Soon they were on their way again. Maximus drove for a while, and he was doing fine until they reached a point where the trail had mountains of sand covering it. At that point, Achilles took over again. Outside, the scene shifted from sands to sands with more rock formations. They kept on driving till the sun began to set again. That's when Daedalus had his second daily awakening. "Ah, Maximus, good to see you up, young man. You were still asleep when I woke this morning," Daedalus said with a smile. "Likewise, sir," Maximus replied. Daedalus looked outside and said, "It seems we are nearing the location. The Vulcan capital is built on a harder surface than the desert, and the increase in rock formations and such seem to suggest that we are in close proximity to the city by now." Daedalus then turned to Achilles and asked, "Have you made contact with your friend yet?" Achilles shook his head and said, "Not yet, and it's already becoming dark out." I guess we'll have to spend another night in the desert before we reach the city. Daedalus nodded. Try to get as close to the city as possible before we set up camp. The guards shouldn't try to stop us until we reach the city walls. After 15 minutes, Daedalus went off to dreamland again, and they kept driving through. Once a couple of hours more had passed, they started to see something from the horizon. They were streetlights, and Maximus realized that they had nearly reached the city. Once the city lights were in view, Achilles said, "This is as close as we can get without being spotted. We'll stop here for the night and head to the city once daylight hits us." They nodded in agreement and got out. The desert had become ridiculously cold again, and they started to build a fire one last time. They were on the last strands of their supplies. They just had a few vegetables and the emergency provisions they had salvaged from the wrecked car. They turned out to be some very tasteless crackers. They ate and talked for a while, and soon enough they were heading to sleep with Hedger standing watch for the night. The Soldiers of Ares, Chapter 15. Maximus was in deep sleep when it happened. He was dreaming about a giant sand serpent offering to buy his sword, and it was offering chocolate ice cream in return. He was tempted to sell too, but that's when Hedger woke him from his very weird dream. For a few seconds he was confused, but when he came to his senses and looked around, he saw that everyone was awake and staring at Hedger. Hedger, on the other hand, looked like he'd seen a ghost. "What's wrong?" Achilles asked. Hedger was still white-faced and shivering. "Well, there's a tank heading for us, just thought you should know." All of them stepped outside to see what he was talking about, and that's when Maximus saw it. Riding in from the direction they just came was a tank, and it wasn't just any ordinary tank either. Rumbling towards them with both its giant barrels aimed at them was one of Mars's most powerful weapons, RAM, tank. Along with the tank were 4 jeeps filled with Ares' soldiers. The jeep in front had its top down and a woman with blonde hair and a spear in her hand. She looked like she was shouting something, but Maximus couldn't hear her yet. But he knew one thing: Captain Deborah Sharp had just found them. "It seems like our old friend. The captain has finally caught up to us," Rex said. "Man, she is not a happy lady. I for one can wait a lifetime before seeing her again, and it looks like she's bought a battalion," Hedger said. They all looked at Achilles for directions. He was stone-faced again. "Trying to take them all on will be suicide. Our best option would be to run and try and lose them in the city," he said. Without further delay, they started up the truck and began moving again. Achilles really floored the pedal, and the truck was moving as fast as it could. Suddenly they heard an explosion on their side, one that could have easily leveled a building, then another one right behind them. The RAM tank was firing at them, and the tremors from its shots could be felt inside the truck. Maximus looked outside to see that the tank was too slow to catch up to them, but the jeeps were gaining on them. They were in shouting distance now. They started firing their machine guns at them, and now it was just the armor of the truck that was saving them. The only good part was the tank had stopped firing now, since it didn't want to hit the jeeps by accident. "Don't you guys have anything to shoot back with?" Achilles asked. "Sorry, but you sort of slashed up the only gun I had, remember?" Rex said, holding onto a wall so he wouldn't fall from the really shaky ride. "Maximus, take the wheel," Achilles said. "What?" Maximus said as if he was crazy. "Just drive and keep heading to the city wall. Let me see if I can do anything about those jeeps," Achilles said. With some difficulty, Maximus got into the driver's seat and took the steering. Achilles, on the other hand, kicked the window open behind them and jumped into the cargo hold. Maximus was trying to move the truck forward as steadily as he could, and it was not an easy task. Outside, he saw that the jeeps were right behind them now. In the back, Achilles took out the walkie-talkie again. He handed it to Hedger and said, "Keep trying to make contact with the city." Hedger nodded and went to work. Then Achilles drew his sword. It was glowing blue again, and it looked like he was charging it up for something. He turned to Rex and said, "On my signal, open the back door." Rex nodded and readied himself by the door. Daedalus had curled up in a corner again. It seemed to be his body's default response to danger. Achilles' blade was humming now, and blue sparks were coming from it. He steadied his stance the best he could by putting his metallic foot forward. "Now!" Achilles shouted, and Rex swung the door open. With a quick jab, Achilles sent a bolt of blue energy at one of the jeeps. It wasn't as grand as the one he used against the Manticore, but it did the trick. The bolt caught them by surprise, and one of the jeeps skidded off to the side. This repeated for a while, but Achilles couldn't get a clear shot because of the unsteady ride, and the jeeps were still on their tail. Hedger had been trying to make contact through the walkie-talkie all this time. Finally, the static cleared, and someone on the other side said, "Hello, haven't heard from this thing in a while." "Who is this? Over." It was a man's voice, that much was clear. He also sounded pretty cheerful. Well, hello," "This is a friend of Achilles. Over," Hedger said. "So what can I do for you, friend of Achilles?" "Over," the man replied. Achilles took the walkie-talkie from Hedger and said, "This is Achilles. We are right outside the city now, coming through the desert trail." "Achilles," the man said, sounding excited. "It's been too long. How are you, man? And you're supposed to say over, over." Achilles let out a sigh and said, "Not now, brother. We are being chased by a barrage of Ares' men, including a tank, and we need entrance into the city. Should have known you wouldn't pay a quiet visit. What vehicle are you in?" "Over," the man asked. "A transport truck," Achilles replied. "Not to worry, I'll send word to the guards not to attack you. And I'll be there to greet you in minutes personally," the man said. "Much obliged, brother," Achilles said, and with that the walkie-talkie fell silent again. Maximus wondered who the man was. If he was someone who could call off the guards at will, he was certainly not someone ordinary. And Achilles had called him his brother, but the only brother Achilles had was killed in the Trojan War. The story was pretty famous. His name was Patroclus, and he was killed by the greatest warrior on the Trojan side, Hector. They say it was this incident which had driven Achilles with enough rage to challenge Hector in one-on-one combat and ultimately kill him. There was no way Patroclus was still alive. Then again he had believed that Achilles was dead until a few days ago. Achilles stepped forward to Maximus and said, "Just keep driving to the end of the trail. There should be a gate there, and we should be safe once we enter the city." Then he went back to try and slow down the jeeps. Captain Sharp's jeep was right by their side now, and Maximus could see the loathing in her eyes. That's when Maximus saw the guards to the gate entrance. He didn't know what he was expecting, and he wouldn't have been surprised if the guards were humans, minotaurs, or even a cyclops. But what he did not expect were a pair of giant freaking robots. The robots were huge, nearly 15 feet tall. They had 2 legs that ended in stumps. They looked like metal elephant legs. Their bodies were long and straight and only widened as they reached the shoulders. They had 2 arms, one of which ended in a kind of clamp that looked like a hand. The other one had a barrel at the end from the elbow down. They also had a motor or something on their backs with steam coming out of it. It made them look like they were wearing backpacks. Their heads had no mouth or nose. They only had one huge eye on them that gave a bright blue glow. Their head and body were bronze in color, while the arms and legs were made of steel. Also, they had their barrel hands pointed right at them. "Achilles, are you sure these guards are on our side?" Maximus asked, a bit worried. Achilles nodded and said, "My friend said they would be, and I trust him with my life." And sure enough, they passed through without much trouble. But when the jeeps came, the giant robots blocked their paths, and Maximus heard Captain Sharp shout into the radio, "Don't shoot the automatons, you idiots, unless you want to be responsible for starting a war between our countries." And the jeeps stopped behind the robots. But this still didn't stop them from shooting. For a second, Maximus thought that they were going to make it. But that's when he noticed something. "Guys, we have a problem. The gates are completely blocked, and I mean boarded up," Maximus said. The others came to see what he was talking about. Not only were the gates closed, but large wooden planks were also nailed onto it. It looked like it hadn't been opened in a while. "What do we do now?" Hedger asked. "Well, we can't just stop now they're still shooting at us," Rex added. Achilles closed his eyes for a second to think. When he opened them again, he said, "We hammer through." "What, are you crazy?" Maximus shouted. "It's our best option," Achilles said. Maximus still wasn't sure of this, but he was still a soldier inside, and he knew that sometimes following orders was the best course of action. So he floored the accelerator and drove straight into the gate, praying that they survived. They crashed through the gate. Maximus first thought that the truck wouldn't go through, but it did, and they went on spinning out of control into the city. The truck slammed onto the tarred road and knocked over a lamppost. The truck came to a stop by itself without Maximus doing anything, and he was pretty sure that it probably wouldn't start again, even if he tried. Smoke was coming from the engine and it filled the driving seat. He expected the engine to blow up, but right then at that moment he did not care. However, nothing happened, and when the smoke cleared, he looked behind to see if everyone had survived. Everyone seemed to be alive, but all of them were on the floor breathing heavily. Achilles had sat up leaning against the wall, panting. Hedger was still lying flat on the wall, laughing like a madman at the fact that they were still alive. Rex was untangling himself from their bags, which he had fallen into, and Daedalus had curled up into a ball with his arms around his legs, still in his corner. The scene at the gate had changed too. The 2 robots had completely blocked the gate now, and they couldn't hear any shooting anymore. It seemed the soldiers had given up and left for now. Finally, Achilles said, "Is everyone all right?" Everyone mumbled yes without any real energy. Maximus thought it was all over now. But when he looked outside, he saw something that made him think that the trouble had just started. 2 more of the giant metal robots like the ones guarding the gate were pointing their guns at them. and in their middle there stood a man. He was a big man, probably 7 feet tall. His skin was also extremely tanned, almost like he had been sunbathing for a year. He had copper-colored hair and beard, and looked a bit messy. He was wearing large boots with camouflage trousers. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt, which was covered in grease stains, on top of which he was wearing a bronze chest plate complete with shoulder guards. Maximus also noticed that he had a wristband with the yellow summoning crystal on his left arm. Then he took out something from his back pocket. It was a walkie-talkie, and the man started speaking into it. Achilles' own walkie-talkie lit up again. The man's voice came from it and said, "If you're in this steaming truck in front of me, please do respond, buddy. Otherwise, we're gonna light it up like a firecracker. Over." Achilles grabbed the walkie-talkie fast and said, "Don't shoot, it's us." A smile appeared on the man standing outside, and on his signal the robots lowered their guns. Then the man came to the back of the truck and ripped the back doors open. He literally ripped out the doors with his bare hands and threw them to the side. Then he put his grinning face inside and said, "Well, what are you waiting for? Come give me a hug." The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 16. The huge man helped them outside. Achilles was the last to come out, and when he did, the man gave him a bear hug that would have crushed most people's bones. Achilles didn't seem too comfortable with this, but he said nothing. The man finally put him down and said, "It's been too long, Leadfoot. It's good to see you too, old friend," Achilles said. His usual emotionless face had been replaced with a smile. "Come on now, let me introduce you." He then turned to the rest of them, put a hand on the big guy's shoulder and said, "Everyone, this is Ajax." Maximus was starting to feel like his life had turned into a television show, with all of the most famous people in the world guest starring in it. In the last few days, he had already met the greatest swordsman of the Trojan War, the world's most famous inventor, and even a god. And now he was standing there shaking hands with the mighty Ajax. Ajax was yet another famous warrior from the Trojan War. He had fought in the Greek side along with Achilles and was very famous for his legendary strength. And seeing him in person, Maximus understood why. He was considered among the strongest warriors in the entire war. If memory served him right, his weapon of choice was a huge hammer. Maximus had a feeling that's what the summoning crystal on his wrist would bring out if needed. After being formally introduced to everyone, Ajax asked them, "Well, what are you guys doing with Mr. Cranky over here?" patting Achilles on the back. "Well, we're originally from Mars, but we got into a bit of trouble," Rex began, not sure what to say. Luckily, Achilles stepped in to explain. "They helped me rescue Daedalus from Ares' soldiers. But when the army found out, they put a reward on their heads and started hunting them. They had nowhere else to go, so I told them to join me to Athens. It was the least I could do," he said. Ajax scratched his beard and said, "Refugees, eh? Well, not to worry, any friend of Achilles is a friend of mine. You guys can stay here for as long as you like." He grinned at them, and despite his rugged appearance, he seemed so welcoming now. Ajax then turned to Daedalus and waved his arm in front of him to see if he would respond. When nothing happened, Ajax said, "I've met old Daedalus here before. He's a friend of my boss, but he was a lot chattier then." Achilles explained to him about Daedalus and his potion. He also went ahead to explain the rest of the trip. When Achilles was done, Ajax said, "Man, you really can't stay out of trouble, can you?" Ajax then went ahead to give some orders to the giant robots, and soon they picked up the wreckage that was their truck and hauled it off. "Don't worry, I'll have that truck better than new in no time. Fixing up cars is sort of a hobby of mine," Ajax said. "In the meantime, I got my ride parked just around the corner. We'll go in that." As they walked, Hedger asked Ajax, "So who's your boss?" "The smith god Hephaestus, of course. Didn't Achilles tell you I'm his champion now?" Ajax answered. That sure explained a lot, Maximus thought to himself. As the champion, he probably had control over the giant robots, along with most of Vulcan's army. No wonder Achilles thought coming here was a good plan. No one would touch them here with Ajax around. "What I want to know, though, is how the soldiers found us in the first place. I mean, we had been traveling for 2 days and our trail wasn't exactly easy to follow," Rex said. "I was thinking about that as well," Achilles said, but he suddenly stopped walking and looked at Maximus. Maximus turned to him and said, "Wait, I didn't do anything," a bit worried with the look he was getting. "Of course you didn't, Max, but could I just take a look at your sword?" Achilles said. Maximus handed him the sword and Achilles began inspecting it. After a few seconds, he found something below the sword's hilt and showed it to them. It looked like a button in the shape of a small golden wing. Achilles crushed it in his hand and with loathing in his voice said, "Hermes, is that a tracker?" Hedger asked. "Sure does look like it," Ajax said, looking at the now crushed piece of technology in Achilles' palm. Maximus had understood what had happened. Hermes was working for Ares. I mean, who better to track someone than the god of messengers, thieves, and travelers? But Maximus couldn't believe he had been so stupid. Hermes had planted the tracker when he had pretended to examine his blade. Even after that, the blade had been with him this whole time and he hadn't even noticed it. He was feeling angrier at himself now than at Ares. Hedger noticed his face and said, "Hey, Max, it wasn't your fault, none of us knew." "He's right, Max," Ajax said, "but I still think that it's a bit weird that Hermes came himself for this. I would have guessed that taking orders from Ares was beneath him." Achilles still looked angry. He said, "Who knows why? That double-ended snake always has a plan of his own." Ajax placed his arm on his shoulder and tried to calm him down. "Come on, Achilles, relax. You found the thing, didn't you? We haven't seen each other in years now, so don't let Hermes ruin the moment." Achilles still didn't look happy, but he grunted agreement to this. Ajax then turned to the rest of them and said, "Now don't let his grumpiness fool you. This guy is one of the greatest people you'll ever meet. I mean, me and him, we go way back. We're more than just friends, we're brothers in arms. We fought the entire Trojan War side by side, and I could tell you a few stories about this guy. Oh, the things he'd done, the fights he fought, and the women he'd charmed. There's just no end to it." He then stared at Achilles with a grin on his face. "Let's start sharing old war stories after we get to Hephaestus' castle, shall we?" Achilles said, and he seemed somewhat eager to change the subject. They had started walking again, and in a minute Ajax's ride came into view. It was a pickup truck, or at least it had been at some point, because Ajax seemed to have made some serious modifications to it. Maximus could just say one thing about the truck: it looked awesome. "I think I'm in love," Rex said, staring at the truck. Ajax seemed pretty happy to hear this. He said, "Isn't she a beauty? I'm real proud of her, too. I built her up from scratch myself." The truck was big and black in color. On both its sides there were identical half-green, half-blue designs. On a closer inspection, Maximus realized that it was the word Ajax, written in a really big square font. On the back it had a dual exhaust, and on top of the truck were 5 lights in a row pointing forward, like the ones seen on mountain vehicles. In the front, the entire grille was covered by a huge metal guard. Maximus believed it was called a bull guard. The hood was also modified and had a rectangular elevation with an improved air intake system on it. "So this is how you keep busy these days?" Achilles asked. "It sure is," Ajax said, rubbing his 2 hands together. "And now I'm going to take up your truck as my next little project." "That's fine, just don't make it too fancy. We are on the run after all," Achilles said, and Ajax nodded. Then the 2 of them got in the front. There were only 2 seats, so the rest of them sat in the open back of the pickup truck along with their luggage, and then they started moving through the city. The city was nowhere nearly as tall as Thrace, the capital of Mars. The buildings were not very tall either. But Maximus did notice a few huge chimneys that seemed to start from underground. He wondered what it was. Behind the city was the famous Mount Etna, one of the largest volcanoes in the world. And he had heard somewhere that it somehow provided all the energy for the entire city. Between the city and the mountain there was something huge built. It didn't look like a building, but it was still night and too dark to make out what it was. But whatever it was the biggest thing there. They finally reached Hephaestus' castle, which was the largest building in the city, but it still couldn't have been more than 10 stories high, nothing really to the towering castles which Ares built. Maximus was really sleepy by now, so when Ajax took them to their rooms, he didn't even bother to look around. He just collapsed onto the bed without even removing his shoes or his sword. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 17. When Maximus got up the next morning, he thought he was still dreaming. The room he was in was so big he couldn't believe he hadn't noticed any of this yesterday. It was as if he was in a luxury hotel, and it had everything: a television, a fridge, air conditioning, and a huge bathroom. He decided to hit the showers first, and once he had freshened up, he went outside. He was standing in a corridor with rooms similar to his all around them. He was wondering where the others were when a small robot with 4 wheels, 2 hands, and a monitor for a head just rode up to him. It had steam coming from its back like the other robots. The monitor said, "Welcome," and the robot handed him a cup of coffee. Once Maximus had accepted this, the robot said in a metallic voice, "Please follow me to the dining room, sir. Breakfast has been prepared." The robot started moving again, and Maximus followed it. About 3 rooms across, they stopped at a set of large wooden doors. A skinny, skeletal-looking robot was waiting there for them, and as Maximus approached it, the robot opened the doors for him. The robot he had followed till then showed "Good Day" on its monitor and left. He stepped into the room to see that it was a huge dining room, and most of the guys were already there. The room was huge, and there was a long table in the middle surrounded by at least 24 chairs. They were made from some really strong-looking wood and were decorated by bronze lining. Maximus was starting to see a pattern here. Almost everything in the country had some bronze in it. On one of the chairs, Rex was already seated, munching on some toast and jam. Opposite him were Ajax and Achilles. They seemed to be catching up while they ate. It was the first time Achilles had taken off his armor since they met. Now he was wearing a normal gray t-shirt instead, but he still had his sword with him though. But what really surprised him was when Daedalus came up to him and said, "Max, my boy, hope you had a splendid night's sleep." Maximus nodded to him and said good morning. "Well, you're in luck. I would have gone back to my other self in another 5 minutes and 53 seconds. Do take a seat," Daedalus said with a smile. Maximus joined him at the table and placed his coffee cup on it. He greeted the others as well and checked what was there to eat. There was a lot of food on the table. Toast, butter, and jam were sitting right in front of him. Next to that was a steaming pile of bacon. There were also at least 3 types of cereals and bowls of freshly cut fruits. There was also orange juice, milk, and water for drinking. There was also a machine moving along the table refilling cups of coffee. Another robot came into the room on wheels. It was similar to the one that had brought him to the dining room, except it had 8 arms. It came in and placed a plate and a glass in front of him. It also served him a spoon, a fork, and a knife. Then it asked, "Good morning, sir. What would you like to eat today?" in the same metallic voice as the other robot. "Bacons and toast, please," Maximus said. The robot instantly served him what he had asked for. "And would you like eggs with that?" it asked. "Okay," Maximus said. "What type of egg, sir? Scrambled, salted, poached, boiled, bullseye?" Bullseye," Maximus said, not really sure. Another machine popped up from the table and it clanked for a while. Then it served out a plate of eggs. Next, the machine that was serving coffee came up to him. It had 4 buttons on it labeled coffee, milk, juice, and water. Maximus pressed the one that said juice, and the machine went ahead to grab the orange juice and pour it into his glass. "Quite fancy, eh, Max?" "We don't gotta lift a finger," Rex said. He was right. In the trenches they barely got enough food to get through the day, and now it was like they were kings. "I don't think I've ever eaten like this since." "Well, ever," Maximus replied. He looked around to see more robots moving around doing chores. "Is the entire city filled with robots?" he asked. Ajax chuckled and said, "Nah, we got people too, but most of the workers at the castle are, though. Old Hephaestus trusts machines more than living things. These robots are called automatons, and Hephaestus invented them himself. All of the ones you see here are of his design. He really is one of the most talented mechanical engineers I have ever had the pleasure of meeting," Daedalus added. "So will he be joining us?" Achilles asked, taking a bite out of the bacon sandwich he was eating. "Not now, no. He's busy with one of his projects again, and he could be shut in his workshop for days now. But he'll probably join us for dinner tonight when Daedalus here awakens again," Ajax said. Daedalus chuckled and said, "Well, we inventors are like that sometimes. Once we find something of interest, we might become a bit obsessed. I'm afraid I am no better at that." He then went on to finish his cornflakes and said, "Well, I'm afraid my mind will wander again in a few more seconds. When it does, please have someone escort me back to the room. And Achilles, please do buy me a watch from the city when you get the time. It would be very helpful to keep track of my mood timings." And just like he said, within a few seconds, Daedalus began mumbling again. His face went blank. Ajax had a robot escort him back to his room. Maximus was somewhat sad that Daedalus couldn't properly enjoy his stay here. So he asked, couldn't he make another batch of antidote from here? I mean, this place will certainly have the equipment. Achilles shook his head and said, "I'm afraid not, Max. I already asked him. You see, it's not that simple. A few of the materials required for the potion are extremely rare, and some herbs that are needed for it grow nowhere near here. And even if we manage to get all those, making the antidote requires a lot of accuracy and time, not to mention knowledge in the field." Ajax was eating a bowl of cereal, and a very colorful one at that. It was almost funny to watch such a big man eat with such a small spoon some very colorful brand of breakfast cereal. He said, "Donf ritumuk," which nobody understood, of course. Then he swallowed his mouthful of cereal and tried again. "Don't worry too much, Max. We're going to take excellent care of him. Besides, he has already been here a few times. He's seen it all before. But it's the first time for you guys, right? So I'm taking you all sightseeing." He looked at Achilles to see if he would refuse, but he nodded his approval and said, "That's fine. I can get Daedalus a watch when we go out as well." The doors opened again and Hedger glided in lazily. It was easy to see he had just gotten up. "Good morning, all. And does sleeping in not exist in the dictionary of you people?" he said as he took a seat. Once he got a good look at the breakfast spread, he was excited again. Maximus could tell he was really enjoying being treated by robotic butlers as well. "Okay, so maybe sleeping in was not a great idea. Man, this is a life, Hedger said. Glad you guys like it. But finish up fast. There are a lot of things to see in Vulcan City, Ajax said. Once they had all finished, Ajax said again, you guys might want to change before we head out. No offense, but you all look like you guys just came out of the sewers. Sort of smells like that, too. Maximus had to agree. Even though he washed up in the morning, he still wore the same clothes he had been wearing for the last 3 days. And sweating in the desert heat hadn't left them smelling like flowers either. They reeked. The same could be said for Hedger and Rex. None of them had another pair of clothes with them either. Only Achilles seemed to have had a change in apparels. I agree with you, but this is all we got, Rex said. Ajax thought for a second and said, I think we might have some clothes that would fit you guys. He then turned to Hedger and asked, a dwarf's cloths should fit you, right? I mean, we don't have many sprites here, but we got plenty of dwarves. Hedger nodded, and Ajax said, great, just go wait in your rooms and I'll have some butler bots send them up to you. Rex, why don't you come with me? I think one of my old pants will fit you nicely. With that, Rex left with Ajax and the other 3 left for their rooms. The 3 of them reached the corridor where their rooms were. All 5 of their rooms were right next to each other. Maximus went into his room. He had never had such a comfy place to stay ever in his life. His first memory of a home was the orphanage, and all the boys shared a single huge dormitory there. While in the army, he had to share a room with a roommate. He had quite a few roommates too. This was because they kept dying in war. From there, at the age of 17, he started living in the trenches. The first few days were brutal, and he had spent those nights on the street. Then he met up with Rex, whom he already knew from the army. His place was cramped, but he still let him stay, and that's when he started out as a scavenger, since that was what Rex did and he didn't have a partner. He met Hedger, Kyla, and Roderick within the next week, along with many others. It was Hedger who found him his home in his abandoned attic, and that was the first place he had to call his own. Compared to all that, it was like he was in a 5-star hotel now. He went out to the room's balcony to see the view of the city. The first word that came into his mind was steampunk. It was the best way to describe the city structure. All the buildings had a lot of metal on them, and most of it was bronze. Everywhere he looked, there were bronze-covered structures which were spewing out smoke and steam. The chimneys that rose from the ground were everywhere too. He made a mental note to ask Ajax what they were used for. Maximus already knew that Vulcan was famous for mining and industries, and he spotted a few of the mines along the now inactive volcano Mount Etna. Besides the mines, he spotted the huge structure which he had seen the night before. Standing at the base of Mount Etna was a huge bronze statue. The statue didn't seem to depict anyone in particular, as it had a huge ancient-looking helmet on it. It seemed like the standard helmet worn by ancient Greek soldiers. Similarly, it also had ancient Greek armor on it. In its hands was a huge sledgehammer. The head of the hammer touched the ground between the statue's feet. The giant Greek soldier held the handle with both its arms. Its head was lowered, so it looked like it was looking at the city. The statue was at least 50 feet tall. Maximus knew what the statue was. It was called the Colossus, and it was quite a popular tourist attraction. Despite all this, Maximus felt that the city was too small. There were just about 20 to 30 buildings in total. And he felt it odd that he couldn't spot any factories in the industrial capital of the world. Just then his doorbell rang. Maximus didn't get it at first, as he had never had a doorbell before. But when he finally figured it out, he went out to check. It was another robot on wheels, or butler bots, as Ajax had called them. The butler bot handed him some clothes and a pair of shoes and left. Maximus went inside to change and was glad to find that at least there was no bronze on the clothes. They were just a pair of jeans and a black t-shirt with the symbol of Hephaestus on the left side of the chest, a bronze-colored hammer covered in flames. He tried on his new clothes and shoes, and they fitted him nicely. He then grabbed his sword and went over to Hedger's room. When he went into his friend's room, Hedger was already dressed too. He was wearing a thick brown-colored jacket with matching pants. They were definitely dwarf clothes. When Maximus entered, he turned to him and said, "Hey, you look nice. I don't think I have seen you out of your scavenger's special leather ever. But this is good. You actually look like a teenager. Who knew you could pull off something other than dusty brown leather?" Maximus scowled and threw a pillow at him. Then he said, "Wish I could say the same about you. It looks like you're wearing a large sack." Hedger looked at himself in the mirror. "Yeah, leave it to the dwarves to make their clothes so bulky. But hey, at least I got my stunning good looks," he said with a grin. Maximus wished he had another pillow to throw now. There was a knock on the door, and Achilles came in. He was back in his black armor of sticks now, and his blade was on his belt again. And he seemed to have cleaned his bionic leg too. It was a bit shiny, but still he seemed as though he was going for a war rather than sightseeing. He also seemed to have got himself a new cloak to cover up his armor, and he was holding it in his hand. Are you guys ready? I just got word that both Ajax and Rex are waiting near the elevator. Achilles nodded. They nodded, and together, all of them, stepped outside the room. A butler bot was waiting for them, and it led them to the elevator. Ajax and Rex were already there. Rex was wearing a pair of blue overalls. Maximus thought he looked like a farmer. Hedger seemed to be thinking the same thing as well because he said, "Great, you're a farmer and a cow. That sure is interesting." "Shut up, you stupid green pigeon," Rex said, and Maximus knew these guys would never change no matter where they were. And he was kind of happy about that. The Soldiers of Ares, Chapter 18. The elevator came, and the doors opened. The 5 of them stepped inside, and as the doors closed, Ajax pressed floor -30. Maximus looked at the buttons and found it to be very weird. First, there were the regular floor buttons, one that said roof, followed by the numbers 1 to 10 for the 10 floors, followed by a large G for ground. Now came the weird part. There were 30 more buttons on the panel ranging from -1 to -30, and Ajax had pressed the very last one. Maximus had heard of having 1 or 2 basements, but having 30 seemed a bit much. "Shouldn't we stop at the ground floor to go outside?" Maximus asked Ajax. "Not only if we want to get down on the Overcity, and there's nothing much to see there other than the Colossus. I think we should go to the Undercity first." Maximus stared at him, even more confused, and Rex and Hedger joined him. It was Achilles who stepped in to explain. "It seems you don't know, but Vulcan City is the biggest subterranean city in the world. The entire city is actually underground, and the underground area is called Undercity. What you see above is called Overcity, and it's actually the higher floors of the buildings in Undercity that are too big to fit underground." Maximus took in the new information. He knew about subterranean cities before. They were entire cities that were built underground, mostly by underground dwelling races such as dwarves and goblins. But he had no idea that the entire Vulcan capital was one. Self-turning screwdrivers, you guys didn't know that. Achilles, didn't you explain anything to them on the way? Ajax said, with a hand on his head. You guys didn't really think what you saw above was the entire capital, did you? The real city's just coming up. With that, the doors to the elevator opened, and they stepped out. Floor -30 seemed to be the real ground floor, and it was buzzing with life. The elevator opened up into a huge lobby, with lots of different people of different races moving around, going about their daily business. Maximus noticed that the majority of them were dwarves, humans, and goblins. These goblins were all dressed, though, unlike the ones in the desert. One of them was even wearing a suit. Maximus also spotted some other races such as minotaurs, elves, satyrs, and nymphs, although they were much lesser in number. There was even a cyclops in the corner wearing a security uniform, holding a club. There was also no shortage of robots or automatons or whatever they were called. All around them, these machines were whizzing and rolling around doing different jobs. There were 2 of the giant robots with a gun for a hand from yesterday standing outside the main door. A lot of people seemed to know Ajax, not surprising as he was their champion, but unlike the champion of Mars, he actually seemed to be liked by the people. You guys wait here while I go clear up some formalities, Ajax said, and went along to one of the many reception desks situated around the lobby. Meanwhile, Achilles had worn his cloak again and put his hood up. A smart move since the world thought he was dead. After a few minutes, Ajax came back to them with a tissue paper in hand. Maximus noticed there was a lipstick print on it. Got your paperwork sorted out, and got the number of that pretty nymph receptionist in the process. Guess you're not the only one who can pick up girls now, eh, Achilles? Ajax said. I never said that, Achilles said with a smile. I just said I don't have to try very hard. Besides, women were the last things on my mind since my death. After that, they went to the main doors. Ajax pushed them open and said, Behold, the great Vulcan city. All of them stepped outside, and the first thing Maximus noticed was how huge it was. The entire city seemed like it was sitting inside a cave, and the entire city was covered by walls. The word steampunk was still the design of the day. The whole city seemed like a giant metal and bronze maze, with large gears and other devices at work. Also, the city was spewing steam here and there. The smoke, on the other hand, was being let out above ground. There was a huge system of vents that interconnected all the building exhausts into huge chimneys that went above ground. Maximus now understood what the chimneys that he saw above ground were for. He also finally spotted the factories. All around them, near to the cave walls, were huge industries that seemed like giant machines at work. There was a lot of equipment outside the buildings as well, with large gears and levers. But the area they were standing in seemed like a large and open road. It was really noisy and crowded here, and there were an endless number of shops on either side of the street. This seemed like the main market area of the city, and the street was way bigger than the trenches. The city is split into 3 major parts. The place we are at right now is the market area, and it makes the innermost area. If we moved a little outward into the next area, we would reach the residential area. After that, the third and outermost one is the industrial area, and that's where all the factories are. So, if you ever get lost here, just remember to keep moving inwards, Ajax explained. Even though they were completely underground now, it was like there was still sunlight here. Maximus looked up to see huge floodlights on the cave ceiling. The kind they used in sports stadiums or gladiator arenas, only much bigger. Ajax saw Maximus looking at the lights and said, "I see you have found our light source. It's a clever little invention from Lord Hephaestus. The intensity of the light changes according to the light outside. So we have regular days and nights, only without the desert's scorching heat or chilly nights." Maximus had to agree that despite how crowded and confusing it was, the entire city seemed to be designed to run like clockwork. They started walking and Rex asked, "So what about the army barracks?" "Those are situated behind the castle actually. It's not very big since we have a comparatively small army," Ajax said. "Also, more than half of our army consists of automatons and they can be turned off and stored easily during peacetime." Maximus didn't care how small the army was. If it had battalions of automatons, it seemed pretty scary to him. Other than the automatons, our soldiers are few. In fact, we don't even have any generals. The general's duty also sort of falls on me. I'm sort of the head of the entire army, Ajax added, but he didn't seem too happy about that. They started moving through the market now, and there were some really amazing things for sale there. The main goods here seemed to be metalworks, and there were some really fine swords around which caught Max's attention. He was actually saving up for a new sword, but now that he had unsheathed the cursed blade, it would be pointless to buy another one. Also, he had to think of a better name for his sword than the cursed blade. He thought that maybe he should buy a shield instead. There were plenty of those here too. While he was in the army, sword and shield was his specialty, but now that he was traveling, carrying a huge metal shield around would only be more troublesome. Besides, now that they were on the run, spending the money didn't seem wise. They might need it for something more important later. But swords and shields weren't the only things here. The shops were littered with a variety of stuff: gauntlets, energy crystals, oranges, rat soup, grape wine, and electric motors were just some of the things they passed by. Then, Maximus saw something that he knew would surely get Rex's attention. There were even a few shops selling bionic limbs scattered around the marketplace. He knew that Rex wanted a bionic arm badly, but they were simply too expensive. He would have to save up almost all his earnings for at least 5 years to even think about getting one. He caught up with Rex to talk to him privately. "Hey Rex, you want to go check those bionic arms out? Maybe there's something here," he said. Rex looked at him and snorted. "It's no use, Max, you know how much they cost. You know I was saving up for a sword, I don't need it anymore. So, maybe I could chip in." Rex gave him a sincere smile and said, "Thanks for the offer, Max. I appreciate it, I really do. But I don't think we'll be able to buy a bionic finger even if we pool in all our money, much less an entire arm." They walked past the bionic limb store without a second glance. "You guys go on ahead, I still need to go and get a watch for Daedalus," Achilles said and went off. "Yeah, and I think I might need some new clothes as well. As much as I appreciate these overalls, Ajax, I'm not used to covering my chest. Only the females of our race do that," Rex said. "That's fine, Rex," Ajax said, patting him on the back. "In fact, I know the perfect place to find clothes for big guys like us." Then he turned to the other two and said, "You guys coming?" "Nah, I think we'll hang out here for a while," Hedger said, and soon he and Maximus were browsing the stalls alone. They were at this for a while when someone said, "Hey you, the boy with the sprite." Maximus turned around to see who had called. He saw that it was a dwarf. He was barely half of Max's height like most dwarves. He had thick brown hair and an unruly beard. He also had a look on his face like he had just eaten a sour bowl of grapes. "Yeah, you come over here," he said. Maximus didn't like his tone, but he went over anyway. "Yeah, what?" he asked. "Show me your sword," the dwarf said. Maximus was really not liking his tone. "Why should I?" he asked. "Because I said so, kid," the dwarf said angrily. Then he snapped his fingers and 3 goblins surrounded them. One of them snatched the blade before Maximus could do anything. "Hey, give it back," he shouted. A crowd was gathering now, but the dwarf ignored all this and looked at his sword. "This is no fake. It's the real stuff. A pretty high-quality sword." "So how did a piece of trash like you end up with it?" "I don't think that's any of your business," Maximus answered. He was really getting angry now. "You stole it, didn't you, you little thief?" "Well, too bad for you, only we dirt pigs do the stealing around here," the dwarf said. Then he resheathed the blade and with a sick smile on his face said, "So why don't I just take it off your hands?" That did it. Maximus was mad now. He grabbed his blade from the dwarf and shoved him to the ground. But the sheath was still in the dwarf's hands. Only the blade was with Maximus, and it was glowing red. Maximus was staring at his now glowing red blade, but Hedger nudged him on the shoulder and said, Max." Maximus looked around to see they were now surrounded. A few dwarves and humans had joined the goblins, and all of them were armed with swords and metal rods. An energy weapon. There's no way I'm going to let a beggar like him have that. "Get him," the dwarf he had pushed said. Well, things got bad real fast, Maximus thought to himself. But there was no way he was going to just give up his blade without a fight, especially since it was glowing red again. Suddenly, someone cleared his throat very loudly behind them, and everyone turned to see Ajax standing there. He walked into the middle of the commotion and stood beside Maximus and Hedger. He then asked the dwarf, "What seems to be the problem?" The dwarf was stuttering with fear now. No, nothing, Mr. Ajax. This boy has a very expensive sword with him. I think he stole it." Ajax took the sheath from the dwarf and handed it to Maximus and said, "Well, this boy happens to be a very good friend of mine, and I can vouch for him personally." Achilles and Rex also entered from the crowd and stood on either side of them as well. Most of the dwarf's goons had decided to drop their weapons and move away quietly. Ajax then broke his knuckles and said, "So if there's nothing else bothering you, then scram." The dwarf didn't need telling twice. He picked himself up and ran as fast as his tiny legs could take him. His goons were also nowhere in sight now. The crowd that had gathered to see the show had started to disperse. "So what was all that about?" Achilles asked. Maximus and Hedger explained the entire incident. Finally, Ajax said, "You shouldn't blame them, Achilles. I know that dwarf from before. His name is Monroe, and he's as rotten as they get. He and his gang have been causing trouble for a while now, but they're not usually this ballsy." "So these dirt picks are like a street gang?" Hedger asked. "The dirt picks, why do you say that?" Ajax asked, sounding confused. "Well, he sort of said that he was a part of a group called Dirt Picks," Hedger said. "The Dirt Picks are the dwarven mafia that exists in the city. I heard they were recruiting. I guess Monroe's gang joined up with them. Damn it, if I knew that I wouldn't have let him go." They started walking again, and Achilles asked, "So are these Dirt Picks causing you trouble?" "Well, they were always around, but recently they have been trying to expand their men and territory. And if they keep it up, me and the army should be the last of their worries." Maximus didn't quite understand what he meant by this. What would worry those criminals more than the army? Anyway, let's forget all that and get on with the tour. Let's head back and get my ride, then we can head to the industries. The rest of the day didn't involve much trouble. They visited the factories that made everything from paper clips to tank armor. A few of them were tall enough to touch the ceiling. A building has to be at least 30 stories high to touch the top. The floors after that are what you see in Overcity, Ajax explained. After that, they stopped for lunch where they had something called mixed meat kebab. It didn't seem very healthy, but like most things that weren't, it tasted great. They were heading to Overcity next. There was a trail that led directly up from the residential area without going back to the castle to do so. As they passed the residence, Hedger asked, "So, do you stay around here, Ajax?" "No, as the champion I got an entire floor in the castle to myself. It's got everything, including a gym and a garage, even a swimming pool. It's actually quite the sweet deal." Soon they were above ground again and under the scorching desert sun. They were about to reach the last stop for the day, the Colossus. The giant bronze Colossus was even more impressive up close. It looked like a towering icon for the entire city, like a personal guardian to all the people here. On the platform it was standing on, it said, "The Colossus, warrior, worker, and protector." The entire thing was designed and built by Hephaestus himself, Ajax said. "Wow, this thing must be at least 50 feet tall. It must be impossible to build something bigger," Hedger said. "It's 70 feet actually, and you would be surprised. They say that the original Colossus was bigger than this," Ajax said. "The actual Colossus? You mean there's another one?" Rex asked. Ajax nodded. "Not a lot of people know about it really. It's a piece of history that goes back to the Titan War. If the story was as old as the Titan War, then it really was ancient history. That war happened almost 1,000 years ago, the one which the great Emperor Zeus fought along with his two brothers against their tyrant father Cronus. Their victory was what started the current chapter of the world. Well, a long time ago there was an island kingdom called Rhodes. It was ruled by a Titan, and he was ruling it well until several hundred years ago," Ajax said. "Wait, weren't all the Titans put into the great prison Tartarus when the war ended, and that was almost 1,000 years ago?" Rex asked. "Most did, but not all the Titans were on Cronus' side during the war, A few remained neutral, and this particular titan actually sided with the gods in this war. So even when the war ended, he was allowed to keep his kingdom by Emperor Zeus. Now on this island of Rhodes there was said to be a colossus that was nearly 100 feet tall, Ajax said. Hedger let out a whistle and said, "That is one big hood ornament, so if it's so big, how come none of us have heard of it?" "That's because, like I said before, the titan only ruled hundreds of years ago. After that the titan disappeared without a trace. And the strange thing was the Colossus of Rhodes disappeared with it. The kingdom didn't last much after that either. The entire island was ransacked within another 50 years without the titan's protection," Ajax said. Maximus thought about the story he just heard, and it sounded more like fiction to him. But then again, he had heard some weirder stories about gods and titans. "So why do you guys have a colossus here?" Achilles asked. Ajax lifted up his finger and said, well, that's because the original colossus was all of Hephaestus's favorite structure, and he was already around when it went missing. He built this one as a tribute to the old one, but he refused to make it as big as the old one because he had too much respect for the original. After that, they decided to return to the castle. It was late, and Daedalus would wake soon, which also meant that it was time to meet Lord Hephaestus. On their way back in Ajax's pickup truck, Maximus got lost in his own thought again. He had almost forgotten how old the gods really were. All of the 12 Olympian gods were at least over 500 years old. If memory served him correctly, the youngest of the 12 Olympians was the great Dionysus, the god of wine. He was called so because he invented the drink. Now he ruled over the land of Bacchus, which was the largest producer of wine and alcohol in the world. It was also famous for its casinos and other forms of entertainment, and the parties they lasted for weeks sometimes. He knew all this because it was Rex's dream vacation spot. And it was not just the gods. Even his new companions Achilles and Ajax were both also about 100 years old. The Trojan War had happened a century ago. In this world, if you turned powerful enough, the rate at which you aged slowed down. Some people like the gods were so powerful that they were practically immortals. And this was not just measured in battle power. Sometimes if you excel into something to such an extent, the same thing happens and your lifespan increases. This is probably what happened in the case of Daedalus, due to his unimaginable intelligence. Also, some gods were even capable of bestowing immortality onto others. But you had to be at another level of power to do so. In fact, Maximus was only sure of one god who could do so. The great and magnificent Emperor Zeus, the most powerful living thing in the world. They finally returned to the castle and went inside, but before they took the elevator to their rooms, Achilles pulled Maximus aside to talk to him privately. "It seems you managed to activate your blade again," Achilles said. Maximus nodded. "It just seemed to happen when I pulled it from that dwarf." "In other words, it happened when you got angry," Achilles said. Maximus was reluctant to agree to this, but he had to. It was true. "It seems that training you with that sword might be more important than I thought. We could start tomorrow if you're up to it," Achilles said, and Maximus agreed to it. Then they went up to their rooms and had just enough time to freshen up before dinner. Maximus was a bit nervous now. After all, they were going to have dinner with a god. The Soldiers of Ares, Chapter 19. Maximus joined the others and went down to the dining hall again. Ajax was already waiting for them with a drink in his hand. When they came in, Ajax offered them some. Maximus was surprised to see that it was the drink oxytocin. This was an alcoholic drink that was specifically made for minotaurs. Humans usually didn't drink it, and for good reason. The thing tasted disgusting, and you needed a stomach made of iron to hold it in. But somehow minotaurs loved it. Maximus had actually tried it once on a dare from Rex, but he puked it out immediately, and for 2 days after. Rex, on the other hand, was happy to see his favorite drink. "Don't mind if I do," he said, and grabbed a bottle from Ajax and took a seat. Achilles seemed saner than those two, though, he said. "I don't know how you guys can drink that sludge. Don't you have something else like scotch or whiskey, maybe?" On his command, a butler bot poured out a glass of scotch with ice and brought it to his seat. Since both Maximus and Hedger didn't drink liquor, they settled for some cola. "So I checked out that truck of yours and it's pretty bad, but luckily I'm an expert on salvaging vehicles. Still, it's going to take at least a week," Ajax said, opening another bottle of oxytocin. He didn't use a bottle opener either, just his hands. In fact, he was wearing a sleeveless t-shirt now, and Maximus could see that his arms had more muscles on them than most people had in their entire bodies. He also noticed that Ajax had a tattoo on his left arm under the shoulder. It looked like a symbol of some sort, but he had never seen it before. "Anyway, you guys are welcome to stay here as long as you like," Ajax added. "That's fine. Now that we got Daedalus out, we don't have to rush, but still it would be wise to leave as soon as possible." I'm sure Empress Athena will have a lot to discuss with her personal advisor regarding the war, Achilles said. Ajax took another sip and said, So, did you send a message to Athens that you got old Daedalus back? Achilles nodded. Yes, I sent a mirror message when I got here and explained our situation, even telling them to locate the antidote for his potion. I'm sure nobody got it in Athens. Mirror messages were a magical form of communication. Unlike telephones, one could not only hear but also see the person who sent the message, although it was for messages and not conversations. This meant that once the message was sent, the receiver had to send another message as a reply. They couldn't just talk like they did on telephones. But Maximus was confused. It sounded like Achilles said that nobody had got his message. He was sure he meant to say somebody did. They were still talking and waiting for Daedalus and Hephaestus to join them for dinner when suddenly Rex, who had been silent for a while, shouted, That's it! Everyone looked at him now and he was pointing at Ajax. What's it? Hedger asked, somewhat worried that Rex had a bit too much to drink. That tattoo on your shoulder, Rex said, looking at Ajax. I just remembered what it stood for. It's the mark of the Omega-7. Maximus was sure he had heard the name before, but he just couldn't remember what it was. Omega-7, what are they, some sort of rock band or something? Hedger asked. What, no, Rex said. The Omega-7 consisted of the 7 most powerful warriors on the Greek side. They were formed during the war, or at least that's what the rumors say. There was no official record of its existence. Only a symbol, the Greek letter Omega with a 7 running through it. Maximus looked at Ajax's tattoo and realized it was the same symbol Rex was talking about. Rex continued, That tattoo is proof that the Omega-7 existed and that you were a member. Ajax laughed and said, It looks like you got all the facts right, but you shouldn't be so surprised. In fact, Achilles here is a member too. Achilles rolled up his sleeve to show an identical tattoo on his arm as well. So being part of the 7 is a big deal? Hedger asked. Maximus nodded and said, Yeah, actually. I've heard this story too. It meant that they were the most powerful soldiers the Greeks had to offer. They say that even the unflinching walls of Troy trembled when all 7 of them entered the battlefield. Ajax and Achilles shared a smile. It seemed the topic had made them nostalgic. Those were the days, right, Achilles? Ajax said. So are you guys still active? Rex asked. Well, we are all still alive if that's what you meant, but we are all scattered across the world now. I haven't actually seen a few of them in a long time. Achilles finished off his scotch and said, You might be lucky enough to meet one more of us. Nobody will be there in Athens. Achilles and Ajax laughed at the confused look on the faces of the other 3. Maximus felt it was some sort of inside joke between the old friends. They were about to ask more when the doors opened and Daedalus walked in. Good to see you all this evening, gentlemen, Daedalus said. Daedalus seemed to have cleaned up. His full gray hair was cut and neatly combed, and his beard had been trimmed. He was also wearing a fresh blue set of robes, and he really did look the part of a great inventor now. Well, you're looking much better, Daedalus, Hedger said. Thank you, my friend. And it's all thanks to these magnificent automatons, Daedalus said, looking at the butler bots. Oh, I was supposed to send word to Hephaestus when you arrived, Ajax said. Then he called one of the butler bots and typed something on its monitor. The robot sped away out the door, probably to fetch the smith god. Daedalus also took a seat among the others. Achilles informed Daedalus that they would be staying for another week. That is a fine decision. I must say I have actually begun to enjoy the time I have in my head. It gives me so much time to think, and I have already thought of at least 20 new experiments to try when I get back. I might begin to drink the potion to get away from my busy schedule from now, Daedalus said. My only worry is about the soldiers chasing us, Rex said. Ajax gave a loud laugh and said, Those stiffs are not going to dare enter the city. You see, the truth is they can't afford to piss off the Vulcan Empire. Maximus wasn't quite sure about that. Ares was the kind of guy who would gladly go to war for less. Hedger said what Maximus had been thinking. I don't know, Ajax. Ares is the god of war because he enjoys the war more than the victory. He has no trouble picking fights. Well, all that is true, but he still won't make a move against Vulcan, Ajax said, taking a sip. Let me explain. You see, Vulcan provides weapons and ammunition to both Mars and Minerva now. If Mars was to attack us, then Athena would instantly come to our support. Then the supply of weapons to Mars would stop, and we would completely side with Athena. This would definitely turn the tides of war against them. In fact, if it wasn't for this, I personally think Ares would have attacked us long back. If you don't trust Ares, why don't you just side with Athena already? Achilles asked. Just then the doors opened again, and a man came in and he said, Because I have no interest in their bloody politics. The Soldiers of Ares. Chapter 20. Lord Hephaestus had finally shown himself. Maximus had seen many gods on television and in pictures. He had also met Hermes in person, so he wasn't sure what the smith god would look like, but this was definitely not what he had expected. He was big, and by big he meant bigger than Rex and Ajax. He had thick brown hair and a beard that was so overgrown and untidy that you couldn't really tell where the hair ended and the beard began. His eyes were the color of copper, and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept for days. Also, one side of his face looked like it had been hit by a truck. He even had a few teeth missing. No wonder I have never seen Hephaestus on television before, Maximus thought. He definitely had a face for the radio. There was even a screw stuck in his beard. Below his neck he had a huge barrel chest with a lot of chest hair protruding out. His hands were so big they could easily have squashed Maximus like a bug. He was wearing nothing but a sleeveless white undershirt, and it was so covered in grease and muck that its original color was barely visible. He also had a huge hammer in his hand that was bigger than Maximus. He was also wearing a large bronze machine on his back that made it look like he was wearing a backpack. But the real surprise was from his waist down. He had no legs. Instead, he came rolling in on tread wheels, the kind he had seen only on tanks. He was connected to these wheels and other gears and equipment from where his legs should have been. Maximus thought he looked like a centaur, only instead of being half horse, he was half tank. Hephaestus rolled in on his wheels. Maximus remembered Ajax saying that the smith god liked machines more than living things. That was understandable, since he was more than half machine himself. I've told you 1,000,000 times not to move around the castle on your wheels, boss. It makes the floor dirty and you sometimes end up crushing furniture, Ajax said. Hephaestus looked down at his feet, or wheels in this case, and he said, "Oh, I forgot I had them on again. Just a second, I'll change now." He closed his eyes and concentrated for a second. Suddenly his wheels began to transform. The wheels and metals around it also began to change place, and within a few seconds, instead of wheels, Hephaestus was standing with a big pair of bionic legs made of bronze and metal. Maximus could tell how tall he really was now, and he was nearly 10 feet tall. He was even taller than Lord Ares. "It seems you have made some improvement to your feet, old friend," Daedalus said. Hephaestus walked forward to greet Daedalus. He was using his hammer like a cane. "It's so nice to see you active again, instead of just staring off into space," Hephaestus said. Daedalus chuckled and said, "Yes, it seems one of my own experiments has caused me a hindrance again. And it's definitely not the first time. And if I know you, it won't be your last," Hephaestus said. "You're one to talk. If I recall correctly, you have had quite a few backfires from your works as well. Remember the whole Iron Giant Talos incident?" Hephaestus laughed loudly at this, and it made their chairs shake. "Lucky I encrypted a deactivation module in the processors of its foot, or I would have never heard the end of it. I hope you learned your lesson with artificial intelligence and function encoding with that. At least now you sustain a termination program within all your automatons," Daedalus said. They continued to talk like this for a while, using words which Maximus didn't completely understand. He was pretty sure a few of the words weren't even in the same language. After a while, Daedalus turned to them and said, "It seems I must turn in for the night. I only have 1 minute left on my clock. And speaking of clocks, did you manage to get me a watch, Achilles?" Achilles nodded and took something out of his pocket. It was one of those old pocket watches, complete with a chain and everything. "Here, I got you this since I knew you loved collecting old technology," Achilles said. "I also got a wristwatch for myself so that I can keep in check of your timings." Daedalus took the pocket watch happily. It looked like someone had given him an early birthday present. "You know me too well, my friend," Daedalus said. Then he turned to Hephaestus and said, "Well, it seems like I must take leave now. But we'll catch up again tomorrow. Please have one of your automatons escort me back to my room and bring me some dinner there." Daedalus just had enough time to wish the rest of them a good night before he turned into his mumbling self, and then Hephaestus had one of the butler bots escort him back to his room. "Great man Daedalus, one of the greatest minds I have ever met," Hephaestus said. He then turned to the rest of them and said, "Who the heck are you people?" Ajax sighed and said, "I already told you about them. They're the crew that rescued Daedalus from Ares. Plus, you promised to behave better when we had guests." Hephaestus scratched his beard and he finally found the screw that was stuck in it. He threw it on the ground and one of the butler bots cleaned it up immediately. "I suppose I did agree to that," Hephaestus grumbled. Then his eyes lit up and he said, "That means one of you is Achilles." Achilles stepped up and said, "That would be me, sir." Hephaestus sized him up. "So you're the great warrior everyone talks about. Ajax had already told me you weren't really dead. Clever move, though. By the way, your mother was an old friend of mine. In fact, she made me make some armor for you during the Trojan War. Now don't tell me you lost it." Maximus knew he was referring to the armor of Styx. He hadn't lost it, of course, but he seemed to have left it in his room for dinner, Maximus thought, but he still had his sword, though. Just then, Achilles put his hand in his t-shirt and took out a chain he was wearing around his neck. In the place of the chain where the locket would have been was a summoning crystal. He tapped it, and in a flash of light, Achilles was wearing the armor of Styx. Hephaestus seemed delighted to see his old work. Yes, this truly is the greatest armor I have created. I never had such amazing materials to work with either. I still don't know how your mother managed to get her hands on the black metal from the Styx. He checked to see if the armor had any scratches or nicks on it, and he found nothing. Well, this really is the invulnerable armor, Hephaestus said. A pity I ran out of the rare metal to complete the armor, and I see you had to pay dearly for that. Maximus knew the story. It was a famous one. The invulnerable armor of Styx had covered Achilles from head to toe except at one point at his heel. It was the only point in his body that was vulnerable, but no one was able to hit him there during the entire war, not even the great Hector. But at the end of the war, Hector's brother Paris made the most amazing shot in history. With a poisonous arrow, he managed to hit Achilles right in the heel. The poison had supposedly killed Achilles, but Maximus knew now that this wasn't the case. But this incident had coined the term Achilles' heel, and it meant something's weak spot. You know, I always wondered this. I have met that runt called Paris who supposedly made that amazing shot. He's the champion of Venus now, but he really didn't seem like the type to even lift a bow without shaking with fear, much less shoot with such precision in the heat of battle, Hephaestus said, narrowing his eyes, almost certain that something was amiss. Achilles nodded to this and said, "That's because he didn't. The one who actually made that shot was Apollo." Hephaestus began laughing and shouted, "I knew it!" But the news caught everyone else by surprise. Even Ajax asked, "What? Why didn't you tell me?" Achilles just lowered his head and said, "What difference did it make? By the time I woke up again, the war was over and we had won. That was what was important." Hector glided in between everyone and raised his arms and said, "All right, now wait just a cotton-picking minute here. My history may be a little rusty, but didn't Emperor Zeus forbid any of the gods from directly entering the war?" This was true, of course, to make sure that the Trojan War did not turn into a world war. Emperor Zeus had forbidden any of the gods from directly entering battle. But they were free to support the side they chose in any other form they chose. When no one corrected Hector, he then asked, "Then why didn't Lord Zeus punish Apollo for what he did?" "Maybe he just didn't know," Achilles said. "Apollo had made sure that Paris got the credit for killing me in order to mask his involvement in the war. Maybe like everyone else, Lord Zeus believed this as well." This made sense to Maximus, but then Hephaestus said, "You would be surprised what Zeus would let Apollo get away with. After all, he and his sister Artemis have always been Zeus's favorites." "So wait, how did you survive the poison then?" Rex asked. "Well, after I got shot, a few members of the Omega-7, including Ajax here, found me and rushed me to my old master Chiron and Daedalus. The two of them managed to prevent the poison from killing me, but my leg was too damaged by then and they had to amputate it. It was almost a month before I regained consciousness, and by then the world already thought I was dead." Silence followed what Achilles had just said, and finally Hephaestus asked, "So was it Daedalus who fitted you with a bionic leg?" And Achilles nodded yes to this. That probably was not the question Maximus would have went with, but he wasn't a god, so what did he know? "And I also recall a nice shield I had built to go with the armor. You didn't lose it, did you?" the god asked. Achilles showed him his left gauntlet. It had a blue crystal on it, and Maximus realized it was another summoning crystal. "Excellent," Hephaestus said. Maximus wanted to know more about what happened during the Trojan War, but just then the doors swung open, and around 5 butler bots came in with trays of food. Their dinner was finally here. On seeing the food that arrived, everything else was wiped clean out of Max's mind. He thought the breakfast here was too good to be true. But this was something else. He didn't know where to begin. Right in the middle of the table was a huge, fully cooked wild boar. The entire thing was covered in gravy, and it had an apple in its mouth. Next to that were sizzling plates of kebabs made from every meat imaginable, like chicken, beef, mutton, and even moose. There were 2 fully stuffed turkeys on both sides, and a big hot plate of large chicken drumsticks. Maximus thought that the chickens must have been on steroids because each leg was bigger than his arm. There was also a spicy duck pot roast and a literal mountain of sausages on another plate. There was also a large cylinder of spinach soup. "I'm going to go out on a limb here and say you guys are not vegetarians," Hector said. "What gave it away?" Maximus said with a grin. "Nonsense," Ajax said. "We have green food. Here looks spinach soup." The soup was definitely green, but it looked a lot like barf. Maximus was glad when Achilles decided to put the lid back on it. They started to dig in, and everything was delicious. The spinach soup sat there forgotten. Even Hephaestus had eased up a little more once he had some drinks in him. He was drinking huge jugs of cold beer, but it really didn't seem to get him drunk. "You know, I always wondered why it was okay for minotaurs to eat beef," Hedger said. "The same reason why it's okay for you to eat birds. We are nowhere near the same species. We just look alike." "So shut up and eat your chicken," Rex said. "Well, at least you admitted you look like a cow," Hedger snickered. Hephaestus took a large bite from a turkey leg and said, "Okay, so I know who Achilles is, but who the heck are you guys? Are you soldiers from Athens?" They all looked at each other, and then they explained how they had helped with rescuing Daedalus. Hephaestus heard the story and said, "Martian soldiers helping out Athena, well, that's a first. I can understand how that would put you on Ares' bad side." He took another bite and asked, "So, you guys are refugees with no country now, huh?" The three of them nodded in agreement. "And you two are ex-soldiers. So what happened to that job?" Hephaestus asked next. "Well, Max here quit the first chance he got. And, well, I got thrown out after my injury," Rex said, looking down. Maximus knew he was not comfortable talking about this, but Hephaestus gave an understanding nod and said, "The world is not kind to you when you're crippled. I know that personally from experience. But thankfully, there was nothing wrong with my brain, and I was able to build my own limbs." He was referring to his mechanical legs, of course. Rex just grunted in agreement. Hephaestus started scratching his beard in deep thought, and finally he said Rex was it. "You don't seem like a bad guy, so how about I fix you up with some metal limbs?" Rex's eyes widened, and he clearly couldn't believe what he was hearing. He slowly said, "But I don't have that kind of money." "Oh, don't talk nonsense, dear lad. I got plenty of money. I'll do this for you free," Hephaestus said, taking another huge sip from his jug. "And don't think I'm doing this out of pity either. I love working on bionic limbs. They're so complex and a real challenge, and I love a good challenge. Yours should be really interesting since I've never worked on a minotaur before. So what do you say, you in?" Rex just stood there so dumbstruck he couldn't say a word, but luckily Hedger helped him out and said, "I'm sure if he hadn't just swallowed his tongue now from all the excitement, he would have said yes, and thanked you a million times." And Rex nodded to this. "Excellent. It looks like I got myself a new project," Hephaestus said, and he sounded like a child who just got a new toy. He then turned to Ajax and asked, "When are they leaving?" "In about a week's time, I guess," Ajax answered. "That's even better. A deadline should really help me work more efficiently, and it amps up the challenge. Have all of his things shifted to one of my labs. Use Lab 3. Hephaestus then turned to Rex and said, "A week is a real challenge, so you'll be staying in one of my labs the whole time, since we have no time to waste. And don't worry, I'm going to make you the best bionic arm and eye you have ever seen, and maybe even fit something on your horn if we have the time." He started walking away. "Come on now, let's start right away. I'm going to get this done in a week, even if it kills you," he said, sounding real excited. "He's joking, of course?" Rex asked Ajax. "Of course he is. I mean, a few of his guinea pigs have died before in his experiments, but I'm sure that won't happen to you," Ajax said with a sheepish smile. On that reassuring note, Rex followed the smith god out the door. After they had left, Hedger began to yawn and said, "Well, that was an exciting dinner, but I think I'm going to hit the sack now." Everyone agreed, and they all got up to head for bed. Before Maximus went into his room, Achilles stopped him and said, "Try to go directly to sleep. I'll come and call you early in the morning for your first training session." Maximus agreed to this and went inside. He fell straight onto his bed when he entered his room, and it only took a few minutes before he was fast asleep. This has been a chapter from Book 1 of the new World Odyssey series, The Soldiers of Ares. Links to the books in the bio. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this chapter, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. See you in the next chapter.